Our collective Our collective aim is to help raise national attention to this important justice movement while offering a critical lens to help inform our audience about this work. So today's panel, as you can see on the screen, is entitled, "Is Tending to the Mental Health of Human Rights Defenders as Good for the Cause as it is for the Crusader?" And today's speakers will explore the importance of focusing on mental health strategies to strengthen resilience of human rights defenders who are engaged in racial justice work in the US in order to assure the vitality and success of the social transformation movement currently underway. Typically or often, transitional justice focuses on mental health in a backward-looking manner, seeking to heal the trauma of survivors, and may overlook the need to attend to mental health and well-being of those survivor activists who are in the process of seeking justice. This oversight may lead to burnout, depression, and other mental health challenges, which ultimately weaken the crusade for truth, reparations, and justice. So we've invited panelists today to share their national and international experiences that will not only speak of this general potential problem, but also speak about community-driven strategies used to support those who are leading the way as human rights defenders. The speakers series is a collaborative effort, as I've mentioned, but I do want to, in particular, thank the co-organizers, Yael Danelli, who directs the International Center for the Study of Treatment and Prevention of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, and Laura Ligore, who directs MindBridge. Both of them will be participants in today's panel. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few logistics. We will be closing the chat during the panel. However, the question and answer option is available for anyone who wants to post a question. Once the panelists have concluded their discussion, we will open the chat if anybody wants to post a question or a comment in the chat. So to begin today's panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Laura, who will serve as today's moderator. She is executive director and founder of MindBridge, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to transforming the impact of human rights work by integrating psychological and neurobiological applied science. She's also a clinical psychologist in the service of social justice and human rights, and we're very fortunate to have her today to facilitate this conversation. So thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. And I look forward to hearing today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It is my profound honor to be here moderating today's panel. And thank you so much, Lisa, for inviting me, the New England Law, Boston, for inviting me as well. It's been lovely working with Lisa and Yael on the vision for this really, really important work. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. For some people joining us, they've been working on transitional justice for a really long time. And for some people, this is a new concept. So I was going to offer something of a prologue as means of introduction to today's work. Traditional justice refers to how societies respond to massive and serious human rights violations. And so in doing so, it asks some exceptionally difficult questions that brings in aspects of law and politics, social science, cultural brokers and ambassadors such as artists to come together and to decide how best to grapple with this process of transforming justice and harm, how best to lay the path forward. But beyond all else, traditional and transitional justice seeks to center the individuals and communities who experience this harm. So how do we as human rights defenders want to make sure that we are protecting the rights and the dignity of the individuals and communities seeking justice as we collectively work towards real accountability to true acknowledgement of harms that took place, and how do we redress for the harms suffered? So how do we create that transformation that transitions us from harm and injustice towards a new future? And this is often an exceptionally long process that takes place over the course of years, and in some instances over the course of entire lifetimes, generations. It involves a wide range of sectors, of individuals, of organizations, government actors. And to say that this process can be taxing is probably an extraordinary understatement. And especially when we're thinking about topics regarding racism and racial justice, perhaps even more so. So scholars, psychologists have discussed the way in which experiences such as vicarious trauma can take place as a result of being in close proximity to the work, especially over the long term. And critics have increasingly started to question how the health of human rights defenders is being taken care of. How are we holding the health and mental well-being of human rights defenders who are at the forefront, at the front of the line of much of this work? And in fact, critics have been saying that we've been neglecting the health of and mental health of human rights defenders, and that this neglect has been taking place in the realm of human rights organizations, funders, and among the defenders themselves. And now we'll add to that that human rights and human rights defenders thinking about mental health and mental health wellness has often been put to the wayside. And now we want to bring in an additional layer for human rights activists who have been seeking to promote transitional justice, and particularly human rights defenders who have been seeking transitional justice within racial justice movements. Human rights defenders who are seeking racial justice, and human rights defenders seeking racial justice who they themselves might identify as a person of color. So not only are we contending with the lived reality of racism in each and every day within our own lives, but we are active within a realm of seeking racial justice with and in partnership with the individuals and communities we are trying to support. So this brings up really important questions about how is the mental health of Black, Indigenous, people of color, individuals and communities, human rights defenders within this realm of this crucial, important work, how are we supporting the mental health of these individuals, communities, and organizations at the forefront of racial justice? And so some of these questions have started to come up and have been coming up for a while now about how to address mental health of BIPOC human rights activists working within racial justice. And then questions about how do we possibly bring in the realm of clinical psychology and merge that with the experience of communal forms of wisdom. How do we really integrate the two in the best way possible? The American Psychological Association has recently put out quite the statement talking about the role of clinical psychology in upholding and perpetuating racism, racial discrimination, and at times violence. So how we bring together clinical psych with communal forms of wisdom is an incredibly important topic. So really it all kind of comes down to how and what is the best way to move forward. And these are the questions that are at the core of our panel today. So I'd like to go ahead, oh, it's great to see everyone. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today we have Dr. Yael Danieli, who is the founder and director at the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. She's going to be offering a global historical overview of whether and how mental health has been approached and utilized to support the ubiquitous challenges of practitioners of transitional and reparative justice around the world, so bringing in that global context. We welcome Donovan Brown, who will address the topic from his perspective as founder and director of the Horton Keller Center for Traumatic Healing. We welcome Cheryl Davis, Human Rights Commissioner for San Francisco, who will provide background on the San Francisco Truth Initiative and share how mental health factors into that work. We welcome Taisha Bankhead, Director of the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, who will share their experience of the restorative justice for Oakland youth, and in particular, its collaboration with the San Francisco Truth Initiative. So we'll hear from each of our speakers today. After our speakers have had an opportunity to share their work and perspectives and experiences with us, I'll be inviting our panelists to be in conversation with one another. Sometimes we kind of talk past one another. So we want to be able to have some time set aside where we get to ask each other some questions and raise some ideas that might have come up throughout the course of our time together. And then afterwards, we're going to open the floor to questions from our listeners. So please feel free to jot those down and we'll come back to you at the end. So with no further ado, I would love to welcome Donovan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, Laura. Thank you so much for the context that you provided, setting the stage for the discussion that we're having. And I am grateful for the work of the center and inspired by the work and legacy of Dr. Yael Daniele. I'm glad to call her a friend. I think that in our first conversation we had, I felt as if I had a new friend. We first started talking about each other's names. I remember asking her, how should I pronounce her name? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the various areas of work and or civic labor that I do in my community and describe what that has looked like, describe the tensions that have been present. And then at the end, I'm going to, in a sense, talk about some things that are at this moment experimental for me, trying to make some updates in terms of how do I care for myself in the context of seeing the grand vision of the challenge being so important, seeming that it's easy to find that I become secondary or tertiary to the cause itself. So as it's been noted, I direct and founded what's called the Horton Keller Center for Traumatic Healing. It's a partnership between a church's nonprofit community health center, and it was founded in the context of a YMCA, which is in a neighborhood which is essentially gentrifying, but it also serves an exclusively African-American community or a largely African-American community. And so it's designed intentionally to borrow and integrate some of the components that have been a part of African-American traditions for healing for the better part of centuries. And the kickoff for the Horton Keller Center for In-Person Work was going to be on March 19th, 2020. And in my mind, I prepared what I was going to say. I was going to describe how today is the first day of spring, and spring itself doesn't actually create life, but it creates the context where that which began to die in fall and fully enter death in winter can now come back to life. And so we were going to describe ourselves as being a place that we could cultivate a sense of safety, that it would be a context where people could begin to reconnect with parts of themselves that begin to die as crises began to mount. And so that work was starting, and then the pandemic happened. And I love starting new things, love new challenges, but with new entities comes the stress and strain of organizing, creating rhythm and culture, and ensuring that new habits and rituals can be developed. Now, I wasn't being mindful of the fact that in the midst of all the other things I was doing, I was also starting something new. So that had its own tension and stress, even though this is designed to actually care for one of the most economically depressed communities in my entire state. So I do that for labor and work, but because of COVID, of course, things began to shut down and we shifted our labor to being in person. And our hope is to finally kick off, rather we shift to virtual, and our plan is to move to in-person labor actually next month. I'm also the chair of what's called the Ed Johnson Project. It was established back in 2016 in the context of the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and the long care for justice and reckoning around the legacy of lynching in America. Ed Johnson was someone who was falsely accused and wrongly convicted of a sexual assault in 1906. And it was a really brief case, and his attorneys were told at the end when he was convicted, despite having like 20 witnesses that said he was crossed down at his job, that it would be better for Ed Johnson to die at the hands of the state than to be lynched by a mob. His father reached out to some African-American attorneys locally, and they decided to take on the case, and they organized a strategy. And ultimately, the case was heard before a United States Supreme Court Justice, Justice Harlan, and he provided a stay of execution. And this stay of execution was fundamentally a provocation to the South. We were still in the shadows of the Civil War. And a day after this stay of execution was provided for Ed Johnson, he was walked down to a place called the Walnut Street Bridge, which is, if you were to visit Chattanooga, it's an exceptionally prominent place of the city. Everyone who visits come to see it. You have wonderful views of the city, the surrounding topography, and the Tennessee River. And it's now a walking bridge. And he was lynched upon that bridge. But before before he was lynched, they offered him another opportunity to confess of his alleged sins. And he says, "God bless you all, I'm innocent," before over 1,000 people took his life. The Supreme Court actually tried its only criminal case for those who were responsible for his crime. So a collection of citizens began to take on the burden of the community a century ago, and they organized and they decided to move towards memorializing him with statues of Ed Johnson himself, the two attorneys, and also to the other victims of lynching. And this is in the most prominent place in our community where the statues exist. And the work itself required engaging with the community at large, engaging with city government, county government. We had 50 public events where over 3,000 people came, saw a rough cut of a documentary about Ed Johnson's life. And essentially we did fundraising. We raised over $1 million for the public art project. And I became a member in early 2017, became the chair in the midst of COVID, the summer of 2020, about 9 months before construction began. And we had all kinds of crises. I mean, we had large crises, we had small crises, with internal crises as we are humans moving through society, moving through life and our own challenges. And not only do we have those challenges, I proposed that as we were nearing the completion of the memorial, that we had instead of having a single event at the bridge itself where the lynching took place, where the memorial is, that we had, I think, the opportunity to actually have a series of forums or really a multi-day event. So we planned 17 events. We invited specialists. We even had Eddie Glaude as a keynote speaker. We invited a conversation between John Meacham and the historian and Eddie Glaude, and had the opportunity to actually moderate that discussion. And we did projects with a local PBS station. And the summer of 2021, I had a close friend asking me, like, "Donovan, are you resting? Donovan, are you resting? Are you taking breaks?" And I said, I can't until we're done. So somehow, even though exhaustion was building, as I was doing the work for the Horton Keller Center, as I was doing the work of the Ed Johnson Project, as we were planning these 17 events, as we were in the midst of COVID, additionally, as parents, as someone who loves history and does DEI trainings, we're going to school board meetings yelling about critical race theory being this absurd thing that's ubiquitous, not knowing that critical race theory is something you could go to graduate school for and maybe learn about. And that was sort of painful in and of itself. So I developed the capacity to not be aware of my own tiredness, which was something I didn't even quite know that I could do. But I think it was the vision and the mission was so great that I wanted to keep moving forward no matter what. I also organized work at the cemetery where Ed Johnson is buried. It's a beautiful cemetery called Pleasant Garden Cemetery. It's privately owned. It's 26 acres, African-American cemetery, established in 1891. And essentially, it was abandoned in like the early 70s. So I'm one of 3 or 4 different groups that's organized to take care of this 26-acre cemetery where there are thousands of people buried. There are hundreds of graves where there are 3 or 4 feet impressions. So while the place is also beautiful and remarkable and serene, it's a place of death and tragedy, and it's a place of the forgotten as well. So interfacing with that place in the context of the other work. And then I was doing DEI trainings, which requires its own kind of wear and tear, its own kind of really active engagement, facilitation, and really having to be on your toes, engaging on issues of racism that affect me as an individual and my family as a community and the nation at large. There's a kind of wear and tear there. And ultimately, in the midst of this, I love researching, and the work that I do requires researching. So if I'm listening to a book, it's a book about American history as it relates to race, equity, and justice. So ultimately, everything that I was doing for the better part of 3 or 4 or 5 years centered around individual death, communal death, the misrepresentation of what happened to individuals. So there was the bearing of the truth, and then it was me engaging or other folks engaging in modern generations about crimes and evils that our society had yet to rest from. So with the Ed Johnson Project, I think a mistake we made collectively was not ourselves. I think we should have included a therapist on the team itself or had a mental health clinician that we checked in with maybe quarterly, because we are dealing with another generation shame, but we're also dealing with someone's wrongful death. And we're dealing with the fact that the 2 African-American attorneys had to flee the community. So this present refreshment of evils done to another person, even though there can be an enlivening that comes with this kind of justice work, but there's a wear and tear. I think as well, we're also dealing with the trauma of Ed Johnson's family, the trauma of Ed Johnson, and the trauma of the community since then and now, as the story of Ed Johnson was never forgotten. And I think that with trauma, there's always shame. And I think that we didn't do a good job. And I take responsibility for not proposing that we, invite someone who can actually help us negotiate the challenge of bearing the burden of a previous generation's evil and how that interacts with us, our present engagement with our community. I think with the Horton Keller Center, I think a mistake that I made, even though I love starting things, was just honoring the fact that they're being mindful of the fact that there is a kind of physiological, psychological wear and tear that comes with starting a new entity. And then it was compounded once COVID hit. With Pleasant Garden Cemetery, I think that this one to me is a challenge. I think all I could do is just honor the fact that this is a place of death. There are challenges here. It is beautiful. And I can't at this point see where we, thus far as my team, made a mistake. But I think for me, the cumulative effect. Oh, another thing about Pleasant Garden Cemetery, the community that surrounds it is actually a city within our city of Chattanooga. This city is called Ridgeside. Ridgeside has a very particular racial history. That racial history is such that if you have a family member buried in Pleasant Garden Cemetery, the only way to get to it, you have to drive through this community with its very particular racial history, which means every time that I go into the cemetery myself, there's the stress of me trying to keep my head down, drive as sounding quickly through as I can without possibly having the police call to me, which happened 2 weeks ago when I went by to do some work at the cemetery. So being mindful of that fact and processing that reality with my team. And with DEI trainings, I think my team, we did a really good job of processing the challenges of the kind of wear and tear that comes with the interfacing within diverse populations. And I think for me, with the perpetual practice of researching history, I think that I needed to better practice grief instead of feeling grief. So at this phase of my life, I want to make the distinction that because I feel grief because I feel sadness, doesn't mean that I'm actually processing or practicing grief to actually allow my body to exercise that sadness. So at this point, I've made a few adjustments to my life. One is I'm someone who loves to sprint within projects, and I love to work on multiple projects. And I'm trying not to put the gas pedal to the floor. So I will coast more than I will. I will respond to less emails. I'll respond to less calls. And I'll try to keep some of the frenzy at bay that I kind of love, this controlled frenzy. So I'm trying to do much less of this as a healthy practice for myself. Additionally, within the context of the Horton Keller Center, we are planning essentially something like a soul care retreat for those in my community that have been on the front lines of fighting for justice and equity. It's come to my attention that many folks who've been organizing efforts to care for the community at large, to fight for better laws, better police practices, they themselves are in burnout and are hopeless. And after the dedication last year of the Ed Johnson Memorial, I entered burnout. I didn't even know what it was. I just essentially lost like all energy. And that to me was profound. So I am being less responsive sometimes to even healthy needs. I'm trying to hit the gas less. And I'm in the process of organizing a retreat to care for individuals in my community, including myself, who have really exhausted themselves, really bearing the burdens of modern society and the undealt with evils and traumas of the past.
Thank you so much, Donovan. Holy smokes, your work sounds absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for all of that work. And I'm hearing a few things. I'm hearing the accumulation of that kind of work, right? The death by 1,000 paper cuts, the way in which the wear and tear, I heard you say a few times.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy, for people who do the kind of work that we do to be so motivated by the quest, by the championing of justice and healing for others, that I think even maybe the neurochemical release of fighting for such a wonderful causes can numb or minimize our own capacity to even quantify the challenges that we're facing internally. And somehow I duped myself into thinking perhaps I was invincible or that I can bear this. And then it's not, there won't be a straw that breaks the camel's back. Somehow I thought that I've learned things about myself. I may never do for the rest of my life what I did throughout 2021. It may never happen again. So I think some of y'all might identify with the fact that we can be so drawn to the work that we cultivate a capacity to miss how it's actually even affecting us as individuals.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope we can come back to that thought at the end, particularly, because often as human rights defenders, avoiding the exhaustion or the acknowledgement of the exhaustion or avoiding the acknowledgement of the grief becomes a really effective way of also avoiding having to really contend with that, to really kind of see that within the self and being able to heal. And I think that that's a really important part of this conversation. So I'm hoping we can come back to that. Thank you so much, Donovan. Next, I would like to welcome Cheryl Davis.
Hello, thank you. I'm really just grateful and honored to have this opportunity to share with you a little bit. By way of background, my name is Cheryl Davis. I'm the executive director of the San Francisco Human Rights Commission. And we have been charged with doing several different initiatives in San Francisco focused on a lot of different communities, but what I will highlight and talk about here today is our work around the African American, the Black community. 3 initiatives that are really intertwined, and I have a few slides that I'll share to help me stay on track and on point. One is the San Francisco Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, which was launched as a project of a movement that's happening nationally. And then another is the Dreamkeeper Initiative, which is an investment of $60 million a year for the Black community that was allocated by the mayor and the board of supervisors president in San Francisco, the Dreamkeeper Initiative. And we also support and oversee the African American Reparations Advisory Committee. And so one of the things that we really wanted to work on and be intentional about was making sure that we were able to align those efforts and be able to be intentional about the work that we were doing. So I don't know if Chris can pull up the slides, but if not, I will just definitely keep going. We launched the Truth and Justice Reconciliation through a process with the former DA, Chesa Boudin, and with Fanya Davis and James Bell, really focused on addressing the harms that have come to Black people in San Francisco. And so often we are able to kind of downplay the reality of what it is like to be a person of color in San Francisco, because we talk about our liberalism and our progressivism, and yet it is, I was born in the South and often say I prefer the overt or the covert, right? Like I prefer to know exactly where people don't want me to be versus going into spaces and sometimes wondering if they would prefer I not be there. And so part of this has been San Francisco's Black population has gone from in its highest nearly 100,000 people to now less than 40,000 people in the city and county of San Francisco. And even with that, we still see the same disparities happening, whether it's the justice system, the education system, our homeless population. And so the harm continues to be less than 6% of the population, but 40% of the homeless population, nearly 50% of the folks who are incarcerated represent more than 30% of suspensions and expulsions in schools. And so those numbers alone, just hearing them, can be harmful to folks. Like it becomes this battle to continually fight. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. We really wanted to be intentional about like how we align this work. So one of the things that we had to do is not be in this place where we pull people in a million different areas and spaces and places. And so the intentionality, the alignment said, there are already 2 initiatives happening in San Francisco. As we add another one, let's not further burden the same people who are doing that work. Let's also not duplicate efforts. So the intentionality, the alignment to say, what can we leverage from the other groups? How can we build on what's already being done versus starting something new that does the exact same thing with the exact same people and becomes yet another burden, or becomes another way to broadcast the harm and the pain without addressing the harm and the pain. Next slide, please. So really what's been awesome about working with Fanya Davis and Our Joy is honing in and being very intentional about leveraging the 4 R's of restorative justice and accountability, recognizing the harm, right? And so often people will say, we've already done this, right? You've asked us this question, or we've recorded this before. So the intentionality on our part was, what does the data already say? What narrative stories have already been told? What things already exist, so that we're not going out and re-traumatizing people by asking the same questions? How are we elevating and amplifying that? The piece that I think I want to talk more about today is this idea of taking responsibility for harm. So often we talk about the policies and the language of apology, but we don't actually talk about the responsibility of harm and the reparations for the harm, right? So we think about the programming, but we don't really think about the people. We think about the policies, but we don't think about the people. And so when we talk about this, remember that our systems are made up of people, and the folks who develop the policies and who run the programs also need to be supported. And we have to build in, we have to be intentional. And we have been about the practice of embedding in the work that we do, the practice of restoration, the practice of rest, really funding that in a way that typically has not been part of the bureaucracies of the work that we do. And making sure that as we have these conversations, that we talk about preventing the recurrence, that we are embedding practices of health and wellness, and doing that with a cultural lens. Next slide. So this practice of really thinking about it in terms of this continuum of work is, what's the integration of the visionary and the practical? And I think of it in the sense of, I really like to look at the lessons we can learn from history, right? So when we think about Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman, they were able to be practical and make sure that they were delivering on the work, but also being visionary when in times when it wasn't looking like it was going to happen. The other piece that we try to embed in all of the work that we do, and Fanya has been great about this in our meetings with the Truth and Justice Commission, to practice movement, right? To take the time to actually breathe, or to get up out of your seat, or to move around, so that we're not just sitting in those moments of despair, but that we take a moment to actually release, to breathe. The other piece of this is culturally music. How do we leverage and think about the music? How do we think about how we process our emotions? And so again, I go back to folks like Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman and Howard Thurman, who practice in their own ways a level of spirituality. And I want to make the distinction between religion and spirituality, right? Religion in the sense that we're talking about believing in something, hoping for something, the idea of being connected to people, this idea of transcendence, that we're getting beyond something, that it's bigger than us. So that idea of affirmation in a spiritual sense. And then also calling into play the idea of hope, and a line from Dr. King that says, we must meet finite disappointments with infinite hope, right? Like that we can not get bogged down in and really commit ourselves to the moment right now, that we can own that this is disappointment, that we can own that this is not happening in the way that we want it to, but that we can have that moment, but that we move beyond that moment. And hope allows us to say, things are not the greatest right now, but we can believe and hope for something to be better. And that we also, as we in that believing, how are we building our beloved community? How are we connecting with each other? How are we practicing love? And in that practice of love, self-love is really most important to me, that we can't love others without at least finding love for ourselves. The next is for me, I was starting my career as a kindergarten teacher, and this idea and notion of creativity and knowing that there is actually health benefits to that. So again, like not being rooted in like, we're just going to get through these activities, but how do we take out our markers? How do we think about how we move in these spaces? How do we draw? How do we think about it in a different way? It allows us to practice creativity, allows us to reduce anxiety, like science has shown that. It addresses the depression that may come from that. So we're very intentional about how we build those pieces into it and how we process the trauma. Right, like as we go through these things, that we're not just moving through it, that we take a moment to draw or illustrate how we're feeling in that moment when we may not have the words to do it. And it allows us to move things forward. And then the hardest part, and I think Donovan talked about this as well, is to make the time. Right, like we just have to have some tragic sensibility, which means that we have to prioritize some things and say, maybe we can't do this, because I need to make sure that I take time for rest, or I take time for meditation, or that I take time for creativity. Like we have to just make time for those things. If we go to the next slide, I want to make sure we get through. So key components to this are affirming humanity, right? Like as we do this, to not lose sense of people and self and each other. That we are building a beloved community, that we're building a community that connects and supports and helps each other, and that we're able to stay hopeful, right? In the midst of those shattered dreams, like let's take the moment and realize that things didn't happen the way that we wanted to. And whether we do that through meditation or drawing or through music or movement, but that we take those moments to process the disappointment, but that we then use that to stay hopeful. The next slide. And so lastly, I will just say, like, as we do this, this is the practice that we are not just talking about, but that we're actually funding. That when we think about being human rights defenders and that we do this, it's not just about like how we go out and advance this work. It is about how we think about the lessons that we've learned from the past, how we embed them, how we fund them. Meditation, whether you call it prayer or meditation or yoga, is beneficial to the body, to the mind, to the soul. Like we need to embed that. Those are the gifts that my ancestors gave, you know, that they talked about when I was growing up, a mourning bench, where people just went and sat on the bench and practiced mourning and being quiet and kind of reflecting on the experiences. The best part of the ancestral gifts is storytelling. The way that stories were passed down, how they were used to inspire, but also to give lessons to avoid repeating things of the past. How do we think about music? How do we think about movement? And one of the things that we've been investing is culturally affirming spaces, right? Like when we talk about like moving money or creating spaces, how do we make sure that they affirm the person, that they affirm the history, that they affirm the culture? And the other piece around this is assembling, making sure that we have a space to come together, to be together, to celebrate each other, to celebrate our history. There's so much more that I would want to unpack, but I think about the idea of music itself and this idea of celebrating each other and our history, even in those moments of despair. And I reflect on, there's a song that I remember growing up when they would say, I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, that idea that Benjamin Mays and Howard Thurman and other folks talked about, the aspirational, right? How do we yet in this moment encourage ourselves to believe that it can get better, even if we have to believe it's in the great by and by? That piece of music, how do we take that? How do we embed that? How do we move that? The culturally affirming spaces where it's okay to sing a song, right? Without fear of somebody saying you don't sound good enough or the words are wrong. How do we do that where it's like, it doesn't have to even make sense to you, right? Why are you talking about getting shoes and a robe? But those are the practices that we gain from our history. So I just would say that we have been very intentional in the work that we're doing, whether it's in our meetings, whether it's in the programs that we fund, to say that we want to make sure that we're providing space for folks to meditate, for folks to think about and own that they are anxious, and that we move through that, that we provide space for song, whether you sing it or hum or just listen, that we surround ourselves with a loving community, but that most importantly, that we create spaces where people feel free to dream, feel free to pursue that dream, and feel free to say, like, the dream didn't happen, right? And that's okay. And that there's a community there to support you to move through that. So that is where I will end. And thank you again so much, Lisa, and the group here for this opportunity to share a few words.
Oh my word, Cheryl, I have hope. I have hope. Holy smokes, holy smokes. So much hope. And I love this centering of humanity. And I love your example about, yeah, we're not just going to talk about it. We're going to back it up with some money, and we're going to actually integrate this in. We're going to be really intentional about doing this as an integral component of the work. And I think it's a fantastic example about how we can do this in the future. Thank you so, so much. Oh my goodness. Next, I would like to welcome Taisha Bankhead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Dr. Taisha Bankhead. I am a retired social work professor and a licensed psychotherapist, as well as the executive director of restorative justice for Oakland Youth. And so I'm speaking to you from Mexico, actually, at a retreat for Black elders who lead organizations in this movement. And so I'm actually trying to practice, as I'm here speaking to you, some of the things that we're valuing and that we're talking about that have to do with liberatory practices. So I don't want to say what's already been said, but I do want to, add a few things. I have a lot to say on the topic. So the question, though, I want to speak directly to, which was, the framing of this meeting, which has to do with, is tending to the mental health needs or the mental health of human rights defenders as good for the cause as it is for the Crusader. And specifically and directly, I want to say that they are inextricably connected, that we can't heal. This sounds like an African proverb. It is, I just made it up, but you can't heal the head without the foot, right? So it is a total body that we have to be concerned with healing for. And historically in the movement, I would say for at least 50 years, we have accepted that suffering as a part of the experience as a Crusader. Like the suffering is just what we were to take and to stuff down. And it really was your badge of kind of courage and honor that you were able to muddle through, suffer through, struggle through. And I think that we are now, as a community, as a society, reimagining that. We understand that it's literally killing our people and has. And so this idea of the healer to heal thyself, that the real specific and measurable impacts have to do with things like being more patient, being more reasonable and focused, keeping perspective, not being exhausted, right? And working through our bodies, the multi-generational legacy of trauma, right? The impact on epigenetics that has been tested and studied, and now we have some quantitative evidence to show that that is real, that our bodies are and for generations, our families are changing as a result of the trauma that we as providers and Crusaders are impacting. So vicarious traumatization and secondary traumatic stress are real things. And so what I guess I want to talk to is I want to talk to the multiple layers that we respond to. So that at the individual level, how it's important for us to take action at the organizational level for our organizations, nonprofits, often government entities that are having a response, how critical it is also for community care that we do this in connection with others and that it be seen. And we have models for how to heal, and that there's national and global responses as well. So, excuse me. I want to say a little bit about how our joy, the organization that I lead, responds to this. At the individual level, at the organizational level, and then in community. So at the individual level, for both our workers and the people who are served by us. Well, for the workers first, we have, simple things, a self-care fund. Like, we are investing in people who work for us, who can identify that I need a meditation retreat, or I need a blender, or I need, to take care of myself. I need this exposure, I need this experience, and we really allocate $1,000 a year for that. What's more important, I would say, than the actual money is the investment and the conversation, that people know this is something that we hold collectively as in high value, and seen, and for work to be valued in that way. I would say organizationally, the practice itself of engaging in restorative justice circles, especially tier 1 restorative justice community building circles, is one of down regulation of heightened anxiety and emotion. So every time we sit in circle with each other as staff, and every time we sit in circle in our affinity groups, or African American healing circles, or queer and trans people of color circles, all of that work that we do every week in circle with each other, is a liberatory practice that's intentional about promoting our mental health, about promoting our mental wellness. It's at the center as opposed to a side issue. And it's not something that we say, go off and do that thing on your own, just do it because we know it's good for you. We're practicing it together, we're modeling it together, and we're witnessing each other together engaged in those practices. We, the organization, purchased a farm that we call Ubuntu Farm and Healing Center. So it's a retreat center for gun exposed and trauma exposed community members in our community, people who are exposed to gun violence and domestic violence and other kinds of traumas, have a place to go for respite. What has been historically available only to the privileged, usually white middle class and upper middle class community members, is now available for free to low income community members, who also get access to this privileged experience, which is thought of as the ability, the capacity, and the environment, the conditions to heal. So just even connecting with this concept of the right to heal at all, like the right for pleasure, is dismantling one of the structures of white supremacy and oppression. And so we are passionate about that organizationally and in everything that we do. And we know that it eases anxiety, it improves sleep, it reduces inflammation, right? It reduces pain, it reduces blood pressure. So these are ways that we can measurably see that there's an impact on taking care of the healer, taking care of the crusader, that it has an impact on a positive impact on the cause itself. I guess another thing I want to talk about, organizational, it's not all of what we do organizationally, but some ideas. In terms of community, in connection with San Francisco Human Rights Commission and Cheryl Davis and her work, and Vanya Davis's work, who's a founder of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, we're engaged in these larger scale truth-telling, reparations, and racial healing processes. And the processes for community to come forward in an organized structure, with a structure, to come forward and tell their truths. So to be witnessed, to be seen, that in and of itself is a process of healing, to collect those stories, to make them public, to record them. So so the person and the community that's experiencing this trauma, that it's not dismissed, that it's not overshadowed, that it's not ignored, that in and of itself is a step on the path to healing. And it doesn't stop there, but it is a critical one. And not having to continue to fight just to be seen, and to continue to fight to be heard and to be believed in terms of the experiences of trauma, and particularly racialized trauma that our communities have had. Yeah, it's also a part of communal care to to witness and to participate in these kind of large scale racial healing and reparations commissions. So we've been asked, for example, by the Oakland Police Commission to lead one of those. We've been asked to do that for different cities and school districts and police entities across the country. We are also doing some of that work in Kenya. We've done work in Africa and in Ghana. So at the healing and peacemaking practices that are coming from Indigenous African communities that use restorative justice practices and principles and translating them and engaging in an exchange for our healing in this country. So I think I hit on it all: individual, organizational, community, national, and global. Liberatory practices. I guess the other thing I want to say about that has to do with somatics, and other speakers have addressed this issue of we can't just think our way into healing. We actually have to work it out in our bodies, right? So our bodies feel the trauma, and talking about it is one way of acknowledging it, but to really work it through, we have to move our bodies. We have to get it out of our bodies. We hold this trauma often in our bodies, and we have a response to it in our bodies. And so it's so important to incorporate and infuse somatic practices that recognize the integration of mind, body, spirit, and community, I would say. And so often that's yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, and other ways of reimagining healing, and doing that collectively and having an investment in it organizationally. So I think that's all that I have to add right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taisha. Holy smokes. And and I'm so glad you brought it up. I almost mentioned it in the introduction, that I heard you say that we as human rights defenders have accepted that suffering is part of the experience of the Crusader, and that this is literally killing our people. And I think that that's so important to the kind of cultural cognitive schema that so many human rights defenders are still working within. We should carry this burden. This is part of the process. I'm really glad that you mentioned that. And I really also super appreciate how giving testimony, the process of human rights work in this realm can be healing as well. It doesn't always need to be traumatizing. That part can be super healing. So I hope we can come back to that, because I'd love to talk to you more about that at the end. And with that, I would like to invite Yael Danieli to speak to us next.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. I'm very glad I first heard you. It makes me feel comforted that so much good work and good awareness is happening. It's fulfilling my own dreams. I'm going to focus more on what listening to atrocities does to us in some more detailed way. You'll see. So my colleague Terence Dupre in the 70s wrote, as a witness, the survivor is both sought and shunned. The desire to hear his truth is countered by the need to ignore him. Too close a knowledge of vulnerability, of evil, of human insufficiency is felt to be ruinous. The ostracism of outsiders, of bearers of bad news, as we feel compelled to defend a comforting view of life, we tend to deny the survivor's voice. We join in a conspiracy of silence. So actually, I'm going to focus on stuff before what, in a sense, that you have addressed in more global ways. Sarah Haley, also in the 70s, a colleague who worked with Vietnam veterans then, called her article "When the Patient Reports Atrocities." Indeed, when at the same time I interviewed survivors of the Holocaust and other atrocious crimes for my study of the psychology of hope, to my utter astonishment, I found that every survivor, without exception, said that no one would listen to or believe their traumatic experiences. This pervasive post-Holocaust societal reaction led them to conclude that no one who had not undergone the same experience could understand, and thus to opt for silence. Their children recounted similar experiences. Even more striking and shattering to me as an idealistic graduate student of clinical psychology at the time, they said that psychotherapists, lawyers, teachers too would not listen, thereby participating and in fact making worse the societal conspiracy of silence. My pained outrage at the survivors' resulting sense of isolation and betrayal had been channeled into all aspects of my professional work since: clinical, research, theoretical, teaching, training, organizational, both locally and globally, and advocacy. As a clinician, I built with others the first program to help Nazi Holocaust survivors and their children, which was called the Group Project for Holocaust Survivors and Their Children in the New York City area. I can just tell you how many hours it took in those days to choose to call it the Group Project rather than a mental health project. We chose not to do it in a mental health institution, even though we were offered the space free, because survivors were extremely sensitive to being looked at or seen as mentally ill. You also know that in the history of the Holocaust, the mentally ill were euthanized before the Holocaust itself in Germany. As an advocate organizationally, I co-founded the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies and became its first woman president. As well, in the United Nations context, I participated in creating all international law instruments on behalf of victims, including the elaboration of reparative justice. We can have a separate seminar talking about transitional justice, restorative justice, reparative justice. But in a very short way, reparative justice is really transitional and restorative justice with mental health integrated. So to those of you on the panel, it won't be new. But to address today's poignant, important, yet usually neglected topic, I will share the first body of my work as a researcher, that of studying the phenomenon of the conspiracy of silence about trauma, its origins, meanings, and aftermath in therapists. Now, I'm talking in the 70s, 60s, 70s. Most therapists didn't even know that they were seeing survivors, the same with lawyers, the same with all professionals. They didn't ask and they didn't say, or they somehow shunned the survivors, as Terence wrote so beautifully. So I added another doctoral dissertation of this. And the pain for the need to understand it was because society at large has a moral obligation to share its members' pain. Professionals, be it psychotherapists, human rights defenders, lawyers, judges, whoever interacts with trauma affected individuals and descendants have a professional obligation in addition. If we don't listen, we break our contract, basically. When we fail to listen, explore, understand, and help, we too inflict what my colleague called trauma after the trauma, or the second injury to victims, by maintaining the conspiracy of silence. I also believe that studying therapists themselves, that is people who had to train themselves to understand their own reactions, would help us perhaps shed light on the larger societal or bystanders conspiracy of silence. I find 49 ways of not listening. We're very complex organisms that are built to, in many ways, to defend against experiencing pain, evil, and such. Let me just very briefly put together those 49. It's through kinds of categories, but three. One, there were various modes of defense against listening to traumatic experiences, and on the other hand, against hearing, and and also against our own, the therapist's inability to contain their own intense emotional reaction. So for example, numbing, as Donovan mentioned, denial, avoidance, distancing, clinging to professional role, reduction to method and or theory. So you sit and listen and you sort of plug what you hear rather than be fully there with the person. The second class of reactions are the affective reactions, such as, or the emotional reactions, such in the listener, such as bystanders' guilt, that deserves its own huge seminar, rage with its variety of objects, dread and horror, shame and related emotions, for example, disgust, loathing, grief and mourning, the kind of reactions I call me too, like you're not just a survivor, we are all survivors. Sense of bond, privileged voyeurism, it's like to feel so important and so satisfied for helping, quotes, these people, and to get to know them and their suffering. And the third category, specific relational dynamic context issues, such as parent-child relationship, victim liberator, experience yourself as liberating this poor victim, or the victim of this person who is going to liberate you by the truth, by sharing the truth with you, which is similar to viewing the survivor as hero, and attention and attitude towards the identity, the particular identity of the person you're with, be it color, religion, any dimension of identity. I had enough subjects, since it was research, to compare those therapists who were themselves survivors or children of survivors and those who were not, and that would be of interest to you. So briefly, compared to psychotherapists who were survivors and children of survivors, those therapists who were not reported using various modes of defending themselves against listening to Holocaust experiences recounted by their patients and being overwhelmed by their intense emotional reaction to them. In addition, they reported experiencing themselves as outsiders. And to counteract that experience, they made statements such as, "We all survivors." They also expressed attitudes, feelings, and myths disparaging to survivors, both as Holocaust victims and as parents, while viewing the survivors' offspring as the fragile victims. Furthermore, therapists in the non-victim group showed a pattern similar to the one previously described in working with survivors' population in general, with the exception of expressing jealousy as viewing children of survivors as being special. That is, more than psychotherapists who were themselves victims or children of victims, they reported ways of defending themselves against Holocaust material and their emotional reaction to it, particularly by distancing and clinging to their professional role. More than their counterparts, they expressed rage at survivor parents and disgust. Experiencing themselves as outsiders, they tended to feel pity and contempt, and to view the survivors as having gone, quotes, like sheep to the slaughter. I will take the comparison on the other side. In comparison to therapists in the non-victims group, psychotherapists in those who were from the population itself expressed a sense of bond, a need or a mission to help their people, my people, and the belief that they themselves will be helped in the process. The latter may be related to the therapist feeling more conflict over maintaining their professional authority. So that was a trap they fell into. Again, we can have a whole seminar just on that. They insisted on the need to integrate the Holocaust into the totality of their clients' lives. In addition, both patient and therapist experienced more grief and mourning. Also, more than their counterparts, they often use the words murder and murdered to describe the deeds of perpetrators and the fate of victims of the Holocaust. Psychotherapists in this group also demonstrated essentially the same pattern of response when related to children of survivors as they reported while working with the survivors population as a whole. The differences between these two groups were tested and found to be independent of both the length of experience of therapists and the therapist's gender, which of course has implications for training. We believe, we hold many beliefs about the quality of training, etc., and how much training we need, how much experience we need. That was independent in this case. We are simply, in many, we are all given to trauma. And our professions, unless we are intentional about it, as you so wisely put before me today, unless you pay attention to it, training doesn't provide the capacity to do it. Many of the reactions were found, interestingly enough, we did many other studies with many other victim populations. The issue, what's important to know here is the reactions were, rather than to the patients or clients themselves, what we found across the board, that the traumatic reactions of the therapists were actually to the stories they were hearing, to the traumatic events they were taking in, which is what, as you referred to before me, in that I called it then vicarious victimization of the caregiver. Of course, many other words were coined after that. And again, this is, much of this is published. What's important for us to also historically remember and is that indeed these reactions of therapists, lawyers, defenders are integral to our work, ubiquitous and expected. Our work calls us to confront with our patients and within ourselves extraordinary human experiences. Although today I would write it differently. It's no longer extraordinary, I'm afraid. But this confrontation at all times is profoundly humbling, in that at all times these experiences try our view of the world we live in and challenge the limits of our humanity. I was going to also share with you my notion of processing event countertransference, as I called it then, to process these reactions. Again, that to do justice to it would be to do a whole seminar. So I would not do that. But I have created a process that is quite in-depth and found very helpful. Let me jump to what I eventually, after having done this basically all over the world and thinking about this also in terms of, you said self-healing of the human rights defenders. Let me give you an example of in the work in Bosnia. I worked with old people who worked with people. So it was therapists, doctors, teachers, youth leaders, mayors, anyone who worked with. So, and I get poetic unusually. I much more feel sort of that responsibility thing to be very exacting. So I just called it promoting a dialogue. But one night they forgot the time difference and they called me and said they chose their own name for our project, which was a 3-year project. And they called it Democracy Cannot Be Built with the Hands of Broken Souls.
Oh my goodness, Yael.
Yeah.
Democracy cannot be built with the hands of broken souls.
That's right. I want to remember that. That is the name of our project. So as you see, this is not just about whether therapists listen or not. This is about being together. This is about how we are together, how we fool people within ourselves, how we fully present for people around us. And let me just run on and conclude.
So Yael, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna have to pop in for just a second. I'm so sorry. So sorry. So that we can have time for questions at the end, and so we can talk to each other for just a few minutes at the end. So I'm just gonna pop in for just a minute here. But I have to say, Yael, one of the things I love, your work is extraordinary, and everybody should look up Yael's work. One of the things I love is your international perspective. Because there's so many lessons for us to learn and not reinvent the wheel and be able to contribute to the US experience for sure. At this point, we're going to open up the chat to questions. I'm going to ask our panelists to come back on and see, and I'm going to reach out to our panelists to see if there are any questions that you would like to ask of each other. Let me take a look also at our chat. So while we're thinking about generating questions, I have a whole bunch, as you can imagine. But one of the things that Yael brought up that I'm going to open to the whole floor for a second is this idea of stigma, or the stigmatization of mental health care. So I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts that they'd like to share about that stigma, the way in which you might have come across this in your work, and or the way in which you have worked to alleviate that stigma within your community or the human rights defenders that you work directly with.
I will jump in. I will say one of the things that which is why we've used the language around culturally affirming spaces, is by and large within the Black community, this idea around mental health and wellness has been one where folks will immediately go to when we say, we want you to process how you're feeling, or if we talk about therapy or even a therapist, people will go first to, I'm not crazy, right? Like, and then the stigma around that and this idea of unpacking and having these honest conversations about how we feel. So that has been, we've been very intentional over the last couple of years to have these dialogues and these conversations, but also to reframe it, to talk about health and wellness, to talk about to use the language, and to also be able to refer back to, right? Like when we have these conversations, we do a lot around music. And so using something like Man in the Mirror and asking people, like when we've said to people, how do you talk about or deal with folks who are challenging or who challenge you? Typically Man in the Mirror with Michael Jackson comes up pretty quickly, right? Like, so it allows us to have the conversation about, well, how do I start with me? How do I deal with how I see me versus how other people see me? So I think those conversations, but framing it in a way, I really appreciated Yael's conversation about like the trauma and people being able to realize that. And I think we have to find a way to do it in a way that doesn't further the stigma, right? Where people feel like they have to defend who they are and that they can own who they fully are without fear of judgment.
I first want to say, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I first want to say that I'm grateful to be in I'm grateful to be in a moment where, someone who's designated as an African American, and knowing that legacy that Cheryl was just talking about, how many in our community can be deeply uncomfortable with engaging with said institutions, and certainly with much of the language around the mental health field. And as Cheryl noted, like I'm not crazy. I do my best to use myself, just to talk about myself in story form, to say that I was a high school student, and as a senior, my practice when something challenging happened was I just kept moving. And then something happened as a senior where I couldn't do that anymore. And it took me a few years to realize that, to see the effects of it. And then finally I told them how when I went to college, I would steal these conversations with an on-campus therapist, but would never actual schedule an appointment. So I would catch them around the campus and have a side conversation, but it was never really about me. It was more about ideas. But in part, I was trying to mine information to get help for myself. And then I use stories about my mom. I talk about how, I think for a lot of African Americans, when we feel stress or anxiety, we'll say my nerves are bad. And so I remember there was a day seeing my mom with some of my nephews and nieces, and she she was struggling, and she said these kids are ruining my nerves, right? And I knew she was saying it was anxiety inducing. So I really just try to demystify and de-stress some of the tensions that we can carry around this by just telling my own story in small bits and referring back to my mom, who's a Southerner and an elder, and using language she used, and just tries to pair it and just say, she says nerves, and really what she's saying is just really anxiety.
Thank you. What comes to, well, I will say this, I think that is shifting. So yes, and I would say that what we find in talking to youth and other folks in our community is that the first experience that most people have, or many people have, in the stories about mental health care is mental health hospitalization, really. So mental illness hospitalization is like the first contact, or whether for themselves or for someone else. And so the fear and anxiety associated with mental health treatment is because folks are looking at one end of the continuum of care where there's been a lot of abuse or perceived abuse. And so we work to kind of demystify that and to kind of explain and kind of express that there's a range of places to enter into relationship with someone who might be providing, kind of traditional psychotherapeutic intervention. We also, I think, through restorative justice circles, are giving people an experience of telling their stories, of being heard, being seen, and having experience. And that really models an experience that folks have in mental health treatment. And so for that, folks are more open and more willing to engage in traditional mental health treatment. So it's a kind of like prevention, early intervention, but also kind of a pathway into more traditional treatment. We also don't use the word mental in mental health. We talk about wellness promotion more, because that has some negative connotations for people. But I want to say that I have young people in East Oakland who have an extraordinary amount of trauma in their lives demanding a therapist, saying, I need a therapist, and that is a beautiful thing. And it hasn't happened before. So I am noticing that, say, in the last 5 years, that our young people, they have language around that. And of course, I live in the highest concentration of psychotherapists on the planet in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there are, many, everybody has a couple therapists, Well, I've heard San Francisco, but maybe you're right. San Francisco and New York are rivaling for that. But so it's cultural. I mean, just the mainstream culture of our community. And so even, folks who are very much marginalized in community and racially marginalized have gotten the bug and see some benefit and are more willing to ask for it if ushered in with people they trust and people they have a relationship with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Actually, and particularly after COVID, I think everybody wants wellness and to find who they are, to find some notion of being in this world. And then Putin comes along and upends everything else. So we don't even know if we'll be here. So, but I do want to just add one more point exactly to this discussion. That is part of why we have to be extremely sensitive and learn where our people come from. Because, for example, when all the good mental health professionals ran to help Bosnia, the Bosnians said, we're trained mental health professionals. We don't need you here, right? Because people will come all the way and just start telling them what to do and how to view what they're experiencing. And the other point, so we always have to indeed know where people come from. Of course, the old people who came from the old country have their attitude towards mental health. Young people have their own demand of it, as you said. Yeah, things have somewhat changed. The United Nations, funny enough, there's now the Secretary General is totally, tattooing the importance of mental health. So I'm working now with some of the special rapporteurs on and putting the mental health aspects into what they're focusing on. So the world has been changing. So in that sense, it's comforting. But what you described you're doing in your farm, this has been, when I was this little, I wanted to build a home for people who suffer, and they could just come in and Donovan, it's exactly the same thing you described. They would come in when they felt like coming in, not when I said Monday at 4 o'clock. Right? They came in and they would sort of hang out with each other or listen to music. Cheryl, you're so right. By the way, the only thing I missed in your presentations is humor. Humor is so important in creating some freedom from the horribleness of what we are exposed to.
Right.
So
yeah,
remember fun.
And I'm wondering too, I'm gonna riff on what Yael said, and Yael, you missed the beginning. Cheryl spoke about humor in her presentation as well, and so yes, so for sure humor. So I'm gonna bring us back. So So you talked about this as a right, and you're working with a special rapporteur about this. And privately in the chat, it was asked to me, well, what about the right to mental health is recognized within human rights law? And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explicitly says this and states the right to mental health. So I'm curious about whether this right to mental health or wellness, I think some of you spoke a little bit to this, but I'd love to hear more about, is this something that comes up for you within your work? And is this part of conversations around truth, reconciliation, reparations, this right to have this?
You're asking me in particular, or everybody can address it? Actually?
Everyone, yes.
There is a right. There are so many rights now. The last 40 years of my mission has been to make sure victims know that they have rights. Because yes, we created all these rights. My shelves are full of them. But do people know they have them? Are people in a position to get together and say, hey, this is our right. You, my government, or you, my organization, or you, whoever, you have to provide this. If the best would be if we all get together and share how to provide, how to create it in such a way that it's stigma-free, that it's provided to all. I was hoping, as a trauma person, I was hoping that because there is more understanding that trauma, that people who were trauma victims respond in ways that make perfect sense, right? That will ease some of the stigma, right? That will not fall under, don't, these are Lala people, right? Or
yeah.
And some of it is true, it has happened, but not quite. Not quite. You still hear from our elected officials and our Supreme Court that, and all the gun specialists, and all the gun lovers, that it's crazy people who use guns to shoot people. Okay, so I think, Laura, so part of the issue for us perhaps should be, how do we educate them to stop abusing notions of mental health?
Well, I mean, when you were talking, it made me think about like, who are the credible messengers also in community to share that education and that messaging, to do that reframing. I think about how folks often quote Audre Lorde, and this idea that health and wellness and taking care of yourself is an act of resistance as well. And I think how we frame, how we talk about it can take it a long way, right? So I agree with Tiasha that, definitely seeing more people say, like, I need a therapist, right? But how do we do it in a way, for me, some folks say it, kind of in that levity, to kind of be like, oh, forgive me, but they're not really ready for the next step. They're owning it. They're normalizing the language around it. But how do we have them now become real ambassadors to say, I need a therapist, right? Like, I need to practice the art of healing myself, or of understanding the hurt in a way and to also help people understand it's different for everyone how they process it, right? Some folks may want group therapy. Some folks may want to have one-on-one. Some people may need to do more meditative and yoga. I think that this information session should be a menu of options, right? Like, that this idea and exposure of what it looks like for folks is important.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I know, I'm so sorry. I see we're out of time. We could talk for such a length of time about this, and I think we will. I want to thank Cheryl, Donovan, Yael, and Taisha for being here and speaking to us. With that, I'm going to hand the mic back to Lisa.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. As expected, it was an incredibly rich conversation. In my own work in the field doing human rights advocacy, I immediately was aware of the mental health issues that were a big part of the transitional justice movement in Peru. And in fact, started to get more involved with psychologists there and even wrote a few pieces on the right to mental health, but recognizing that to fulfill that right, especially in a reparative manner, took alternative approaches. And so today is just an affirmation of that earlier work of my own. And one of the purposes of this event was to normalize the idea that, first of all, those who are in this process of fighting for racial justice in the US are human rights defenders, and that racial discrimination and violence is a human rights violation. And one of the very normal outcomes of that is to impact your mental well-being, which is also a part of reparations. So I really appreciate all of you helping to reinforce that message. It is a conversation that I hope can be continued. And thank you to all of our guests who joined us for this conversation as well. So thank you also, Laura, for excellent moderation, and I appreciate your collaboration. So thank you, everyone, and to be continued. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Stay in touch, everybody.